In 2019, Savannah, Georgia, was home to the thriving congregation of the Light of Hope Church, a beacon of faith for the local community. At its helm stood Pastor Jacob Matthews, a 43-year-old leader admired for his inspiring sermons and unwavering dedication to his flock. Jacob was a man who seemed to embody righteousness, his strong moral compass making him a pillar of the community. Alongside him was his wife, Grace Matthews, a 40-year-old woman deeply involved in church activities. She organized events, led prayer groups, and supported her husband in his ministry. Their marriage appeared to be the ideal partnership, a model of unity and devotion that their congregation admired and respected. In the spring of that year, a new face appeared in the pews. Ashley Carter, a 25-year-old woman, began attending services. With her youthful energy, striking beauty, and inquisitive nature, Ashley quickly caught the attention of many in the church, including Jacob. At first, his interest in her was casual, a natural response to her enthusiasm for joining the congregation. He welcomed her into the church community, introducing her to others and encouraging her participation in activities. However, as weeks went by, Jacob found himself thinking about Ashley more often than he should. Ashley, having recently moved to Savannah, sought comfort and a sense of belonging in the church. She admired Jacob's charisma and the passion with which he preached. Her questions during Bible studies revealed a keen intellect and a deep desire to connect with her faith, which Jacob found both admirable and disarming. He began to see her as more than just another congregant, rationalizing his growing attention toward her as a pastoral duty to guide a new member in her spiritual journey. Jacob soon started finding reasons to spend time alone with Ashley. He offered one-on-one mentorship sessions, ostensibly to answer her questions and help her navigate her faith. These meetings initially took place in his office at the church, but as their conversations grew more personal, so did the connection between them. Jacob began to notice details about Ashley that went beyond her spirituality, the way her smile lit up a room, the softness in her voice when she spoke about her struggles, and the way she carried herself with a blend of confidence and vulnerability. What started as mentorship slowly transformed into something much more dangerous. Jacob's thoughts became increasingly consumed by Ashley, and the lines between his duties as a pastor and his personal desires blurred. Despite his inner turmoil, he justified his actions by telling himself he was helping her. He ignored the nagging voice in his mind that warned him he was crossing boundaries he had vowed never to breach. Over time, their interactions became less about faith and more about their growing emotional connection. Jacob knew it was wrong, but he felt powerless to stop the pull he felt toward her. By the early summer, their relationship had escalated into a full-blown affair. They began meeting in secret, choosing a modest hotel on the outskirts of the city to avoid suspicion. The setting was discreet and far removed from their lives at the church, a place where they could indulge their desires without fear of being seen. Each time Jacob left the hotel, he was consumed by guilt. He would tell himself it was the last time, that he would put an end to the relationship and focus on repairing the cracks in his marriage. But every time, he found himself returning to Ashley, unable to resist the connection they shared. At home, Grace began to notice subtle but undeniable changes in Jacob's behavior. He became more distant, spending long hours at the church and coming home later than usual. When he was home, he seemed distracted, often retreating into silence or avoiding meaningful conversations. Grace attributed his behavior to the stress of his pastoral duties, but a lingering sense of unease began to grow within her. She tried to bridge the gap by showing more affection and support, but her efforts were met with a cool detachment that only deepened her concern. Grace continued to immerse herself in church activities, believing that supporting Jacob in his ministry might ease the tension between them. She maintained her role as the supportive and loving wife, unaware of the secret that was pulling her husband further away from her. Meanwhile, Jacob wrestled with his guilt and the increasing difficulty of balancing his double life. He felt trapped, unable to fully commit to either his marriage or his affair, and the weight of his deception began to take its toll. As summer progressed, the fragile facade of Jacob's life showed signs of cracking. His sermons, once filled with passion and conviction, started to lack their usual energy. Members of the congregation began to notice his subdued demeanor, though no one dared to question their pastor. Jacob felt the pressure mounting, knowing that the secret he shared with Ashley was unsustainable. Yet, despite the risks and his own internal conflict, he continued down the path he had chosen, unaware of the devastating consequences that lay ahead. One evening, as the late spring breeze drifted through Savannah, Grace Matthews sat alone at the dinner table, staring at the empty seat across from her. Jacob had called to say he would be late again, citing a meeting at the church. It wasn't unusual. Jacob's pastoral duties often demanded long hours, but lately it had become a pattern. The warmth and connection that once defined their marriage felt like a distant memory, replaced by a growing silence that Grace couldn't ignore. She felt increasingly isolated, burdened by the weight of a marriage that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. In her loneliness, Grace decided to reach out to someone she trusted, Marcus West, Jacob's closest friend and a deacon in their church. Marcus had always been a steady presence in their lives, someone who offered advice and support whenever it was needed. He had been at their side through difficult times and joyful occasions, and Grace had always felt comfortable confiding in him. She invited him over for dinner, framing it as a casual meal, but in truth, she hoped to find solace in his understanding. Marcus arrived that evening, his usual calm demeanor putting Grace at ease. They shared a simple meal, and as the conversation turned from pleasantries to deeper matters, Grace began to open up. She spoke about the growing distance in her marriage, her feelings of neglect, and the loneliness that had taken root in her heart. She admitted that she no longer felt like a priority in Jacob's life and that his work at the church seemed to consume every part of him, leaving little room for their relationship. Marcus listened attentively, his expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. He reassured her that she wasn't alone in her struggles, offering words of comfort and validation. Grace felt a sense of relief as she poured out her feelings, as though a weight had been lifted. For the first time in months, she felt seen and understood. Marcus's presence, steady and kind, became a refuge in that moment. As the evening went on, the conversation grew more personal. Grace found herself sharing thoughts she had kept bottled up, revealing vulnerabilities she hadn't even acknowledged to herself. Marcus, in turn, spoke about the challenges of balancing his role in the church with his own personal life. The exchange felt intimate, almost too intimate, but neither of them pulled away. The emotional connection that had formed between them hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. In a moment of weakness, Grace acted on an impulse she didn't fully understand. Overwhelmed by her emotions and the vulnerability she had just exposed, she crossed a line she never intended to approach. The intimacy that followed was brief, but it left both of them stunned. As the reality of what had just happened sank in, Grace was consumed by regret. The warmth and solace she had felt moments earlier were replaced by a cold wave of guilt and shame. Marcus, sensing her distress, quickly left without saying much. Grace sat alone in the quiet house, replaying the evening in her mind. She couldn't believe what she had done, how far she had let herself fall. She felt as though she had betrayed not only her husband but also herself. The gravity of her mistake was suffocating, and she knew she could never let it happen again. The next day, Grace avoided Marcus at church, keeping their interactions strictly formal. She made a conscious effort to refocus her attention on Jacob and their marriage, determined to repair the cracks that had formed. But the guilt lingered, a constant presence that gnawed at her resolve. Every time she saw Marcus, she was reminded of her lapse in judgment, and the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Grace buried her feelings as best she could, throwing herself into church activities and family responsibilities. She hoped that by being the devoted wife and partner Jacob needed, she could atone for her mistake. But the secret she carried began to take its toll. She became more reserved, her once open demeanor replaced by a guardedness that those close to her couldn't quite understand. Meanwhile, Jacob continued his affair with Ashley, sinking deeper into his own web of guilt and secrecy. Unaware of Grace's internal struggle, he interpreted her change in behavior as a reflection of the growing distance between them. The disconnect between husband and wife widened, each of them carrying burdens they couldn't share. The foundation of their marriage, once strong and steady, now seemed fragile, held together only by the weight of unspoken truths and mutual avoidance. As the weeks passed, the tension in their household became palpable, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. By the summer of 2019, Jacob began to notice troubling changes in his body. What started as occasional fatigue gradually turned into a persistent sense of exhaustion that no amount of rest could alleviate. He found himself struggling to get through his days, often feeling drained even before his duties at the church began. At first, he dismissed the symptoms as the inevitable result of stress. Between his pastoral responsibilities, the growing emotional distance in his marriage, and the secret he shared with Ashley, Jacob convinced himself that his body was simply reacting to the mounting pressure. However, the symptoms grew worse. By midsummer, Jacob noticed that he was losing weight, despite not changing his diet or exercise routine. His once well-fitted clothes hung looser on his frame, and his energy levels continued to plummet. Nights became particularly difficult, as he would wake up drenched in sweat, his sheets soaked through. At first, he blamed the humid Savannah weather, but even with the air conditioning turned up, the night sweats persisted. He began to feel lightheaded during his sermons, and his usual passion and vigor in front of the congregation began to wane. Members of the church started to whisper among themselves, wondering if their pastor was overworking himself. Meanwhile, Grace was dealing with her own unexplained health issues. She, too, had started to feel unusually tired, her energy levels dipping far below what she considered normal. Minor tasks, such as organizing church events or managing household responsibilities, now left her feeling drained. She attributed her symptoms to age and the emotional toll of her strained marriage. Grace had always been resilient, and she brushed off the signs as temporary, believing that she just needed to take better care of herself. The growing distance between Jacob and Grace made it difficult for either of them to notice the other's struggles. Jacob, consumed by his own guilt and physical decline, became even more withdrawn. He avoided Grace as much as he could, spending long hours at the church or in his office at home. When they did speak, their conversations were brief and superficial, filled with polite but hollow exchanges. Grace, interpreting Jacob's behavior as a sign of disinterest in her and their marriage, retreated further into herself. She felt the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her, but the thought of confessing her one-time indiscretion with Marcus terrified her. She feared that admitting the truth would destroy what little remained of their relationship. As Jacob's symptoms worsened, he realized he could no longer ignore them. One afternoon, after nearly fainting during a meeting, he decided to schedule a doctor's appointment. The initial tests didn't reveal much, but his doctor, concerned by the combination of his symptoms, ordered more comprehensive blood work. When the results came back, they confirmed what Jacob had feared but hadn't dared to consider: he was HIV positive. The diagnosis left Jacob in a state of shock. Sitting in the sterile doctor's office, he felt as though the walls were closing in around him. A flood of emotions washed over him: fear, shame, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. He immediately thought of Ashley, convinced that she must have been the source of the virus. The realization that he had likely passed it on to Grace made him feel physically ill. He couldn't bring himself to imagine the pain and betrayal she would feel if she ever found out the truth. Jacob left the doctor's office with a growing sense of urgency. He knew he couldn't continue his affair with Ashley, but he also knew he needed answers. He needed to confront her and find out if she had known about her status all along. The thought of her potentially deceiving him fueled his anger, but it was tempered by his own sense of responsibility for the situation. He decided to arrange a meeting with her, intending to end their relationship once and for all. At home, Grace couldn't help but notice that Jacob's behavior had become even more erratic. He seemed more distant than ever, his mind clearly preoccupied with something he wasn't willing to share. She found herself watching him closely, looking for clues about what might be troubling him, but Jacob had become a master at hiding his emotions. Her own guilt continued to weigh heavily on her, and she struggled with the question of whether to confess her mistake. She wanted to repair their marriage, but she feared that revealing the truth would only push Jacob further away. The tension in their home was palpable, though neither of them addressed it directly. They moved through their days like strangers, each carrying burdens they couldn't share. Jacob focused on preparing for his confrontation with Ashley, while Grace buried herself in her church responsibilities, hoping to distract herself from the growing unease she felt. Unbeknownst to either of them, the cracks in their marriage were widening, setting the stage for the revelations and consequences that would soon shatter the fragile balance they had managed to maintain. In October 2019, Jacob arranged to meet Ashley at their usual hotel, a small, unassuming place on the outskirts of Savannah. The room had always been a refuge for their secret meetings, but this time, Jacob entered with a different purpose. His mind was consumed with anger, betrayal, and a gnawing fear that his life had been irreparably ruined. He paced the room anxiously before Ashley arrived, his thoughts spiraling. The diagnosis he had received only days earlier hung over him like a dark cloud, and he was certain that Ashley was the source of his suffering. He had replayed the timeline over and over in his mind, convinced that she had knowingly put him in harm's way. When Ashley walked into the room, she immediately sensed the tension. Jacob's demeanor was cold and distant, a stark contrast to the warmth he usually showed her. He wasted no time in confronting her, accusing her of infecting him. His words were sharp, cutting through the silence with an edge that left Ashley stunned. For a moment, she couldn't process what he was saying. When she finally understood the accusation, she vehemently denied it, insisting that she was healthy and had never been ill. Her shock and confusion were evident, but Jacob refused to believe her. Jacob's mind was clouded by anger and fear. He was convinced that Ashley was lying to protect herself, and every word she spoke only fueled his rage. He saw her denial as a betrayal, a continuation of the deceit he believed she had orchestrated. His emotions, already frayed from weeks of anxiety and guilt, spiraled out of control. The pressure of living a double life, the weight of his diagnosis, and the fear of losing everything he had worked for coalesced into a storm he could no longer contain. Ashley, though shaken, tried to defend herself. She raised her voice, hoping to make Jacob see reason, but her words fell on deaf ears. He was no longer listening, his anger drowning out any possibility of rational thought. The room, once a quiet sanctuary for their affair, now pulsed with tension. The air felt heavy, suffused with unspoken accusations and escalating emotions. Jacob stepped closer to Ashley, his frustration boiling over. He felt betrayed, cornered, and out of control. As their argument reached its peak, he made a sudden, impulsive gesture. In his anger, he pushed her. It was not a calculated act, but a reflex born of his inability to manage the storm raging within him. Ashley stumbled backward, her footing unsteady. Before Jacob could react, she collided with the edge of the table. The sound of her head striking the hard surface was sickening, and she crumpled to the floor. The room fell silent, the heated argument extinguished in an instant. Jacob stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. For a brief moment, he hoped that Ashley would move, that she would get up and prove that the moment hadn't turned catastrophic. But as the seconds stretched on, it became painfully clear that she wasn't going to move. Panic set in as Jacob knelt beside her, his hands trembling. He checked for a pulse, for any sign of life, but there was none. The weight of what he had done crashed down on him, leaving him paralyzed with fear and regret. He stared at her lifeless body, his mind racing through the events that had led to this moment. The anger that had consumed him only minutes earlier was replaced by a hollow, numbing despair. Jacob knew there was no undoing what had just happened. The reality of the situation was inescapable, and he understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. For a brief moment, he considered running, fleeing the scene and attempting to bury the truth. But deep down, he knew that would only compound his guilt. He couldn't live with the weight of what he had done if he tried to hide it. With shaking hands, Jacob reached for his phone and dialed the police. His voice was flat and emotionless as he confessed to the incident, providing the location of the hotel and explaining what had happened. When the call ended, he sat on the floor beside Ashley, staring at her lifeless form. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He thought of Grace, of his congregation, and of the life he had destroyed in a single, unthinking moment. The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, signaling the end of his world as he knew it. Jacob remained where he was, waiting for the police to arrive. He made no effort to hide or explain away his actions. The enormity of what he had done left no room for denial. As the officers entered the room and placed him in handcuffs, Jacob felt a strange sense of finality. He had lost everything, his family, his ministry, and his freedom, all because of the choices he had made and the anger he couldn't control. The fatal meeting in that small, unassuming hotel room marked the beginning of the end for Jacob Matthews. Jacob's arrest quickly became the centerpiece of public attention, shaking the Savannah community to its core. News of the pastor's crime spread rapidly, fueling debates and dividing opinions. For some, it was a tragic fall from grace. For others, it was the unmasking of a hypocrite who had lived a double life. The media latched onto the scandal, and the story of a respected church leader turned killer dominated headlines. Within days, the Congregation of Light of Hope found itself under intense scrutiny, and the church, once a symbol of faith and unity, became embroiled in controversy. As the police launched their investigation, they began to uncover details that complicated the case. Jacob's confession to killing Ashley was straightforward, but the circumstances surrounding his accusations against her demanded further examination. When investigators obtained Ashley's medical records, they made a startling discovery: Ashley was not HIV positive. The revelation was both a shock and a turning point. It absolved Ashley of the blame Jacob had placed on her, forcing investigators to reconsider the source of Jacob's infection. The police expanded their inquiry, looking into Jacob's personal life and his interactions with others. Simultaneously, Grace, who had been reeling from the news of her husband's arrest, was faced with her own health concerns. Jacob's claims about his diagnosis made her suspicious of her own declining health. Although she had tried to ignore her symptoms, she could no longer avoid the growing fear that something was seriously wrong. Reluctantly, she scheduled a medical examination, and the results confirmed her worst fears. She, too, was HIV positive. Grace was devastated. The diagnosis left her confused and overwhelmed, unable to comprehend how she could have contracted the virus. Her initial reaction was to assume that Jacob had transmitted it to her, but as she pieced together the timeline, the details didn't add up. The realization that there might be another explanation filled her with dread. Haunted by the weight of her own guilt, she began to consider the possibility that her brief indiscretion with Marcus could have been the cause. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Grace decided to confess. She admitted to herself that the secret she had been hiding was no longer sustainable. With a heavy heart, she revealed to the investigators that she had once been unfaithful to her husband. She explained that her encounter with Marcus had been a one-time lapse in judgment, brought on by feelings of loneliness and neglect. Though she had ended it immediately and deeply regretted her actions, she now feared that the momentary mistake had far-reaching consequences. The police, armed with this new information, shifted their focus to Marcus. When they confronted him, Marcus initially denied any wrongdoing. He insisted that he had no knowledge of Grace's condition and maintained his innocence. However, a deeper investigation into his medical history revealed a shocking truth. Marcus had been living with HIV for years and had deliberately concealed his status. He had avoided seeking treatment locally, opting instead to receive care in neighboring cities to keep his condition a secret. As investigators pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Marcus had knowingly exposed Grace to the virus during their brief encounter. Grace, unaware of his condition, had contracted the virus and unknowingly passed it on to Jacob. The chain of events revealed the devastating consequences of Marcus's deceit and the far-reaching impact of his actions. When the police confronted Marcus with the evidence, he attempted to flee, fearing the consequences of his lies. However, law enforcement quickly apprehended him, and he was brought in for questioning. During his interrogation, Marcus admitted to hiding his diagnosis, but claimed that he never intended to harm anyone. His confession offered little solace to those affected by his actions, and the community's sense of betrayal deepened. Grace was left to grapple with the reality of what had happened. Her brief mistake had set off a chain reaction that led to unimaginable pain and loss. She couldn't escape the guilt she felt for her role in the tragedy, even though she hadn't known the truth about Marcus at the time. Jacob, still in custody, learned of Grace's confession and the revelations about Marcus. The news devastated him, compounding his guilt over Ashley's death with the realization that the true source of his infection had been much closer to home. As the full story came to light, the community was left to process the shocking truth. The once respected deacon, who had been a trusted figure within the church, was revealed to be a man who had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The Matthews family, already fractured by secrets and lies, faced the irreparable consequences of their choices. The scandal left no one untouched, serving as a painful reminder of the destructive power of deception and the far-reaching consequences of seemingly small mistakes. At the trial, Jacob stood before the court and confessed to the killing of Ashley. His voice was steady but heavy with regret as he admitted to the events that had unfolded in the hotel room. He made no attempt to deflect blame or excuse his actions. He acknowledged his guilt, his failure as a husband, a pastor, and a man of faith. The courtroom was filled with a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief as the details of the case were laid bare. The judge sentenced Jacob to 15 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter, a punishment that marked the culmination of his fall from grace. Grace sat silently in the courtroom as the sentence was handed down, her emotions a complex tangle of sorrow, guilt, and confusion. She couldn't reconcile the man she had once loved with the one now condemned to prison. Yet, her own role in the chain of events haunted her. Her brief indiscretion with Marcus, an act born of loneliness and weakness, had set off a domino effect that had destroyed everything she held dear. She felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, and though she knew she hadn't acted with malice, she couldn't shake the sense of responsibility for the tragedy that had unfolded. Marcus, too, faced justice for his actions. When his deliberate concealment of his HIV-positive status was revealed, it sparked outrage within the church and the wider community. Many saw him as the ultimate betrayer, a man who had knowingly endangered the lives of others while hiding behind a facade of righteousness. At his trial, Marcus showed little emotion, his once confident demeanor replaced by a hollow detachment. The court sentenced him to 10 years in prison for willfully endangering others, a decision that brought some closure to those he had harmed but did little to heal the wounds he had caused. The fallout from the scandal tore through the congregation of Light of Hope. Once a thriving community built on faith and trust, the church quickly unraveled as members grappled with the betrayal they had suffered. Attendance plummeted, and many longtime congregants chose to leave, unable to reconcile the church's leadership with the values it claimed to uphold. The board of elders attempted to restore stability, but the damage was too great. Within months, the church was forced to close its doors, its legacy overshadowed by scandal and shame. The building, once a symbol of hope, stood empty, a stark reminder of the devastation wrought by the choices of a few. In prison, Jacob began a journey of reflection and repentance. Cut off from the life he had once known, he turned inward, examining the decisions that had led him to such a devastating end. He spent much of his time writing letters to his former congregants, apologizing for his actions and the pain he had caused. In these letters, he admitted to his failures and expressed deep remorse for the destruction he had brought upon his family and community. He acknowledged that his weakness and inability to control his desires had been the root of the tragedy. Though he knew he could never undo the harm, he hoped that his words might bring some measure of closure to those he had hurt. Grace, left alone in the wake of the scandal, found herself at a crossroads. Her life in Savannah was irreparably damaged, and the community she had once been a part of now viewed her with a mix of pity and disdain. She decided to leave the city, seeking a fresh start in a place where she could begin to rebuild her life. She moved to a smaller town in a neighboring state, where she quietly dedicated herself to helping others. Grace found purpose in volunteering with organizations that supported individuals living with HIV. Through her work, she connected with women who had faced similar struggles, offering them the compassion and understanding she wished she had found during her own ordeal. Though Grace's new life was far from easy, it brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. she channeled her guilt into her work, using her experience as a means to educate and support others. Over time, she came to see her efforts as a form of redemption, a way to make amends for the mistakes she had made. While the scars of the past remained, Grace found solace in knowing that she was helping to create a better future for others. The story of Jacob, Grace, and Marcus became a cautionary tale within the Savannah community, a reminder of the destructive power of lies, betrayal, and unchecked desires. Yet, it also carried a message of redemption and the possibility of growth even in the face of immense loss. Jacob's letters, Grace's advocacy, and the hard lessons learned by those involved served as testaments to the complexity of human frailty and the strength required to seek forgiveness and move forward. Though their lives were forever changed, their experiences left an indelible mark on those who heard their story, serving as both a warning and a beacon of hope for those seeking to overcome their own struggles.